Welcome to the Scholar's Nook, where you receive mindful tips for the budding scholar. My name is Dr. Nick Wolf.
And I'm Dr. Stephen Linenberger.
And we are glad you are here. Oh, Stephen, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
I'm on cloud nine, dude. It's a fun time. It's people outside. I'm happy to be here.
That's great. Glad to hear it, Nick.
So today we're going to do something a little bit different. As you know, I'm a quant guy by training, but today I'm hoping to tap a little bit into my inner woo.
Nice.
Today we're going to tackle the concept of complexity. And to kick off that discussion, the first thing we need to do is draw the distinction between a complicated system and a complex system. Does that sound good?
Sounds great. I'm all ears.
Fantastic. So as you know, I'm a recovering engineer. I tend to look at problems the way an engineer might. In our own lives, most works of engineering are complicated systems. A car, for instance, is a great example of a complicated system. There's a lot going on inside of a car, but the components operate mostly independently. The climate control system is isolated from the drivetrain, and if I push the accelerator, the radio isn't supposed to turn on. Here we see closely intertwined but separate systems. A complicated system is a system that includes a set of intertwined simple systems, whereas a complex system is a set of integrated systems. Now, what does that mean? An integrated system. Well, in a complex system, each component part interacts with the others. And therefore, a stimulus applied to one part of the system is going to be felt elsewhere, and the system is going to respond in unpredictable ways. Now, in 1960, a meteorologist, Edward Lorenz, coined the term the butterfly effect. A butterfly might beat its wings in, let's say, Kansas, and therefore create a typhoon off the Chinese coast sometime later. Lorenz was constructing computer models of weather patterns and observed that small differences in the input variables lead to huge differences in weather outcomes over short periods of time. Complex systems have so many relevant variables, all in constant interaction, so much so that making effective predictions of complex systems is impossible. Stephen, have I effectively drawn the distinction between complicated and complex systems?
Absolutely. Crystal clear.
What are your thoughts so far?
Well, as a person who studies and teaches leadership, I immediately thought of leadership as a highly complex process system. External, internal variables can affect the entire leadership dynamic. For example, that's where I went immediately. I mean, of course, we can think about our economy. We can think about all kinds of world events too.
Absolutely. Now, Stephen, as researchers, I'd suggest that we find both complicated and complex phenomena in our organizations. And this has important implications for how we study those organizations. So let's first consider complicated systems. I'll begin by asserting that MBAs love to work on complicated systems. Can you tell me why I might say that?
Because there's a clearer answer. There's problems to be fixed. It's data driven. It requires a rational approach to fix a problem or to monitor something.
Absolutely. Have you ever worked with others at organizations who misunderstood or misdiagnosed what the problem actually was? If so, where do you think they might have gone wrong?
You're putting me a little bit on the spot
Okay.
About this.
And that's fair.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of times the problems I see in organizations are, a problem of somebody, usually a decision maker, a leader. There's an asymmetry between what they see and what the people on the front line see, and that usually creates a huge rift between, management and labor, for example.
I totally agree with that. So you may recall what I said, that a complicated system is a set of intertwined simple systems. And I chose that word intertwined purposefully. Stephen, have you ever held a piece of old school manila rope, the kind you'd find in the age of sail? If you look at that rope, it's actually an intertwined set of multiple smaller ropes or twine. And if you cut the rope, you could easily pull apart those pieces of twine into their component parts rather easily. But the rope is somewhat complicated, but not complex. The component individual strands of twine, although wrapped closely together, nevertheless operate independently from one another, which makes it not only easy to separate, but also easy to understand and manipulate. Similarly, in complicated systems, the ability to slice and dice the system to focus on it piecemeal gives us insight as to how we can understand it. Does it all make sense?
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. Very good. So we think about the features of a complicated system. It allows us to examine each simple system in relative isolation. And this lends itself very well to hypothesizing, analysis, experimentation, variable manipulation, and adding elements of control. And because of all that, it becomes much more predictable and comprehensible for the human mind to wrap their head around. And also importantly, it's modularized. That means I can tune up pieces of it, I can make changes, I can swap out things, and still allow the whole system to work without breaking it. That's what the advantage of a complicated system is. Is all that making sense?
Of course, very good. And again, I'll underscore why MBAs like complicated systems. I think you gave a good example there. Okay.
Okay, so this is a very Western conceptualization of problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
It can be useful, but it does have some limitations. How would you say this is a useful approach? To what extent is this a useful approach to understanding systems, would you say?
Why is it a useful approach?
Well, to what extent is it a useful approach?
Well, it's I'm thinking of the old difference between management and leadership. Management is when you try to do things right, and leadership is when you try to do the right things. So management, I can see where complicated systems are easily managed. Complex systems are not, if I'm answering your question.
I think that's actually accurate. It's very accurate.
Good.
So I would say that this approach is good at studying those things that are physical, inanimate, and maybe broadly defined objectives. So if your desire is to boost sales or to increase throughput, manage costs, characterizing your systems as complicated is maybe reasonably done. However, there's some risks involved there. Like all models, a complicated system is an oversimplification. Moreover, complicated systems usually assume linearity, which means that
Right.
if you were to if you were to change variable x 10%, that would make a 5% increase in y. And then if you were to again to increase another 10%, you would expect another 5% increase in y. Many systems are not linear. And if we are assuming that it is, that can be made very wrong very quickly. Furthermore, another difference between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, if we say a variable moves in one direction, more often than not, a Westerner would presume that it would continue to move in that direction going forward. So things take upon their own momentum and will continue to propagate itself. Someone from more of an Eastern mindset actually would expect the opposite, that things will return to a natural state of balance and center. So if you move right, the next prediction by an Easterby would move left to move back to its natural state of being. So these are very different approaches to how we predict things as a result. Is all that making sense?
It is. Absolutely.
And maybe the worst risk of a complicated system mindset is that it breeds overconfidence. Because if you are so confident in your model, you're going to the hubris of believing that you know all the answers. I'm going to go ahead and try and make all these changes, believing my model is correct, and I might find out with harsh terminology that you might not be correct. Okay. So that's complicated systems. Now let's look at complex systems. Now, complexity is usually the province of life. And we'll come back to that when that's not the case. But Usually when it comes to a backyard ecosystem, the evolution of pathogens or social interactions in our workplaces, life tends toward the complex. There's so much going on that it confounds our ability to fully understand it. Moreover, complex systems cannot be easily separated without breaking the system, so it's impossible to look at each component in isolation. Complex systems defy our traditional sense-making inclinations. So, in short, our Western tendency to deconstruct a system to understand it is ill-equipped to understand complex systems. You checking with me so far?
Absolutely.
Cool. So when we think about how we study organizations, anything social, behavioral, attitudinal is probably going to be a complex phenomenon. And we simply don't have any certainty of how the system is going to respond when we set things in motion. This presents us a challenge, doesn't it? What are your thoughts on those challenges?
Well, one of the hardest things for people to do is have tolerance for ambiguity. You know, we want things to be predictable. I mean, and through this whole thing, I'm reminded of Voltaire's famous quote, you know, the perfect is the enemy of the good, right? And so, you know, I think when we look at complicated systems as we try to manage them, our tendency is to aim for perfection, which has an awful lot of downsides to it.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
So here's where I start tapping into my inner woo a little bit.
Okay.
And here's why the two of us are on these conversations. Yes, I come from a more of a quantitative perspective, but I often struggle with my fellow quant folks to relay them the limpets of quantitative analysis, particularly as it comes to complexity. If I found that when a system is too big to measure, we have to rely more and more on the intuitive insights of the people involved to
Yes,
tell me what's really happening. Do you think I have that right?
absolutely.
So even if they may not have the training to see the system in all its glory, but if you hear enough stories of what they are intuiting from the environment, that paints a very accurate picture of what's really happening. So when we are studying complex systems, I feel we need to adopt more of an Eastern philosophical approach to study. We have to be more driven by trying to understand the context and the climate of the organization taken in an aggregate. And for those who may remember the Karate Kid movies, I try to put myself in the Mr. Miyagi frame of mind. I care about balance and harmony and paying attention to what's going on outside of my immediate focus. In the Eastern holistic perspective, you can't isolate an object from its surroundings. It's all an integrated whole, and you have to take the whole as part of your understanding of the situation. So, with that, we're going to take a moment to consider a couple of the features of a complex system.
Okay.
First of all, as I said before, a system cannot be engaged as an integrated whole. And as a result, it does not lend itself well to hypothesis testing or making reliable predictions. And what I'm saying right now is driving the MBAs nuts. And Stephen, can you blame them?
No.
How would you console them? How would you explain to them the importance of this concept?
Um, I don't know if, well, I think ultimately you would have to show long-term benefit to the bottom line, which turns out, you know, if you can have homeostasis, which is what you're talking about in an organization, that balance, which is hard to come by, and take their attention off of, you know, like, you know, this obsession with data and trying to predict the future, and this, as Friedman calls it, the desperate quest for certainty, and show that that actually is an enemy to the bottom line, then I think you can make some progress.
Very good. So when I consider how to study a complex system, I realized that my approach was very wildly from how I would study a complicated system. We have to resist our desire to try and control a complex system. It's simply not going to do what we want it to do. You'll break the thing before you'll control it. But it may be possible to guide the system into a productive direction. And I would contend that there's 3 steps to help do this effectively. We do this by being highly aware of our environment, taking an experimental approach to working in that environment, and then keenly observe what happens in response. So let's start with awareness. What does it mean to be highly aware of environment as it pertains to study of an organization? Stephen, I'll let you lead off with this one here a little bit yourself here. So when you first walk into an organization, how would you begin your study of it?
I would do what Tom Peters recommends. You have to really look at every aspect of it. The aesthetic is very, very important. The atmospherics right off the bat. Is there a big desk with a small person, hiding behind it, or is it more of an open? I mean, there's so many subtle cues as to what a company values and how they operate just by walking in the front door. If we're talking about a brick and mortar, if we're talking about a website or something, I mean, you can tell a whole lot about the organization just by, if it's a business, how easy they make it for you to do business with them. Are there barriers? Are there, what kind of pictures are on the wall? What's the parking lot look like? This is Edgar Schein talked about this in his organizational culture diagnosis. This is really what tells us more about the organization than any, official documentation or position in the organization can tell us.
So you're talking about essentially looking for artifacts of the evidence of the culture. Absolutely, very, very important aspects here. I have other things to add to that. So
Good.
First, when I look into a new organization that, let's say, has fallen on hard times, for example, yes, I'll review the financials and the metrics and whatnot. But for my chair, those are symptoms of the problem. I generally will not find the illness there. So the first thing I would do is start performing qualitative interviews with a broad cross section of the people in the firm. I allow people to tell their story, but I'm looking for something. I'm looking for patterns. I'm looking for what's changing. You see, if a firm exists, that means at some point in the past, the firm fit with its environment, its context, and probably thrived at that time. So if it's now running into problems, that suggests that there is now emerged some disconnect between the organization and its outside environment. So it's no longer has a proper fit with its context. Are you tracking with me so far?
Absolutely, and I agree 100%.
Okay, so I once saw this idea captured with a very simple model. So imagine a set of tennis balls, each representing an important element of an organization. The people, the technology, the regulatory environment, et cetera, all linked together with a bunch of flexible wires. So you have all together, it's like a big football-shaped thing. So, but where all critical elements are all linked to one another, but there's a lot of flexibility. So if I were to pull on one side or push it or twist it, it still stays together and fine. So a nimble system adjusts to the outside environment and the outside stresses. And problems occur when those connections start to ossify or become rigid. So policies and processes stop adjusting to what's going on, and the system can no longer respond in a healthy way. So those connections, as you adjust it, are now rigid. It's causing weird deformations and maybe even causing damage to the connections or the actual tennis balls themselves. So until those connections are loosened up, we're going to start seeing these things break. So this is where the observation piece comes in. I'm looking for evidence that people in the organization are seeing external changes and what we are doing to change in response to those things. I'm also looking for those areas where things are not changing. because that is evidence of that ossification piece and that rigidity that I'm talking about. I would contend that if you're looking for where the changes are, to what extent the organization is responding to those organizations, that is a good way to point yourself toward diagnosing the problems that are inherent in the organization. Is all that making sense?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So tell me more about what you think about that.
Well, I think you're spot on. I mean, in fact, today I was just working on a paper with a colleague on the effects of burnout on decision making amongst aircraft maintainers in the United States Air Force. And as you're talking about this, I can absolutely see, how this, this is a complex situation where, you do it perfect, you do it right. There's a protocol, there's high expectations. In fact, perfectionism is the expectation, and yet all this works, it puts stress on the system, poor leadership, toxic work environments. You know, Perfection assumes that you're working in a vacuum, but you're not. And you have things like bad leaders, you have toxic work environments, like I just said, you have time constraints, you have, focus on the wrong things. And this all puts flex and stress, not only on the individual, but then ultimately to the system where failures can happen and lives are at risk.
Very good. Now, let's turn to the next step, which is experimentation. So complex systems are going to change and evolve whether we want them to or not. So to help improve complex systems, I would suggest that we must proactively initiate changes to not only maintain alignment between the organization and its context, but to also hopefully improve the lives of those who are in the organization. I think we all want to do that, right? So
Yeah.
consider dating. Dating is a complex phenomenon. We go out with someone, we don't know what's going to happen. We might have a terrible time. We might have a nice meal and a few laughs, and that's the end of it. Or we might find that special person that changes and enriches our life forever. We just don't know, but we have to do it. So might as well get down to it. Now, granted, yes, we should consult our experts in our literature, our scholarship, to design experiments that seem to have a strong track record for making things better. And we don't want to approach these experiments arbitrarily, but ultimately, we can't be sure of what's going to happen. Stephen, is that all making sense so far? What's your
Yes.
what's your take on that?
I think you should keep going. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I want to hear more.
Fair enough. But because we do not have the benefit of a great predictive capacity, as we would in complicated systems, we need to try small scale things and just see what happens. And that's where the keen observation piece comes in. So whenever we begin an experiment, we are rolling the dice a little bit. And again, we can't be sure what's going to happen. So if the response that is generated starts to turn toward the negative, if we quickly change or reverse course, we might be able to stop the calamity before it starts taking on its own momentum. Which is why we have to really be watching as soon as we start doing something new to see what's happening. However, if we perform our experiment and we start seeing good things emerging, well, then we can judiciously expand the experiment and be watchful and constantly listening, and hopefully that would cascade upward. Again, if we start seeing things go a different direction, we can definitely reduce things and try to better control before we unleash the beast, as it were. And incidentally, I found the most effective question to ask in any organization at any time is what's going on, because they'll tell you. Mm-hmm. Stephen, am I right in this? Is there a first question that you ask the people
in organizations?
In an organization,
when I do research, I usually ask people to describe a typical day in their job. What's it like?
it's essentially the same thing as what's going on.
Yeah, what's going on? Yeah. And before we continue, I can't help but think of one of my heroes, Kurt Lewin, although a lot of people pronounce his name Lewin, Lewin.
Right.
Kurt Lewin, one of the famous social scientists. Um, the classic force field analysis
Yep.
is what we're talking about here, which is where you identify the forces that are driving change, you map the forces, create a map of it, and prioritize them to determine the most effective way to achieve change. Then you develop strategies and then make decisions. And of course, you can look at action research then as a big umbrella where once you've done these force field analysis, then you can create an intervention, as you're talking about, where you identify the problem ultimately based on your force field analysis, introduce an intervention and see how that turns out, what change has made or not, and then you rinse and repeat. You start all over again. And that's something I'm in my field, I think action research is going to make a resurgence. It needs to be tweaked a little bit, but it's actually a perfect example of what you're talking about in action. So,
And the one of the things that I really enjoy about force field analysis itself too is that sometimes your job is not to try and find more positive forces, but trying to knock out the negative ones. So if
uh,
you identify what are the obstacles, if you just focus on trying to eliminate the obstacles, the natural momentum, energy that's already behind the change effort will then overwhelm what's left. That's
and may I say too, a lot of times those forces that are working against you are super simple. They're tiny little things that we do. It's a process or a procedure or some reporting mechanism that does not make sense. When you really zoom out and look at it, it's like, why are we doing it this way when that actually works counter to what our goal is? And I think it's really amazing how many times like those tiny little simple changes to a form or getting rid of a process, again, working smarter, not harder, ends up helping create more efficiency, which ultimately always results in happier employees and things get done more efficiently and people are more happy in a more humane environment.
totally agree. So now we've discussed complicated systems, we discussed complex systems. I think it'd be a good idea to do a case history. So, Stephen, what do you know about Herbert Hoover?
Quite a bit, but I think you know more.
Well, I don't know about that, but Herbert Hoover, who would become our 31st president of the United States, was a brilliant engineer who came to national prominence by leading the relief efforts of the great 1927 Mississippi River flood. Now, the tools that he used of engineering and logistics helped him to deal with that crisis very, very well. And in 1929, he entered the White House confident that the tools of science and rationality would aid him in solving any problem he'd face. And then the stock market crashed. Hoover's tool set was equipped to contend with complicated systems. He's an engineer. I said engineers, as well as MBAs, love complicated systems. The economy, though, is complex. The citizenry is complex. All of his plans and programs did nothing to change the attitudinal and behavioral maladies that drove the United States into the Great Depression. 4 years later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the White House with a very different approach. He stopped focusing on things and processes, he focused on people. Admonishing fear, fireside chats, less than productive government programs that nevertheless put people back to work helped. It wasn't about efficiency. He engaged in experimentation, sometimes recklessly, I'd add, but just to see what would happen. His purpose was to restore public confidence through a much more active governmental role. FDR embraced complexity, and that's why he was reelected 3 times. So that's the difference. Is all making sense?
It is. And can we go back to Herbert Hoover 1 second?
Sure, sure.
You know, when you study that man, it's amazing. I mean, there's a lot of comparisons between Hoover and Jimmy Carter. They were both engineers.
Yeah,
Jimmy
yep.
Carter was a nuclear engineer, but a notorious micromanager, very much like you're talking about Herbert Hoover. And they both had big hearts. They were both humanitarians at heart, engineers with
Yes.
a heart. And people forget that Herbert Hoover not only did what you said in the Mississippi Valley in the US, but he helped Belgium get out of a famine in 1915. And then I think it was 1921, he literally saved the Soviet Union, the Russian famine. And I don't want to go into that whole story, but if people want to read up on it, I think there's a good PBS documentary, and you won't even believe. And like in Belgium, I might even be in Brussels. There's a statue of Herbert Hoover because he saved, or some town there I know does have his statue because he saved the town, he saved the people, the Belgians, from starvation because he was really, really, really good at fixing those complicated systems.
It's funny that you would bring Jimmy Carter into it, because there's another president that I always compare Jimmy Carter to. Any idea who that might be?
Not Herbert Hoover.
No, it's not Hoover.
Tell me.
U.S. Grant.
Ah,
The reason why is because both Jimmy Carter and U.S. Grant trusted his staff way more than they should.
yeah,
If you
got him
think
both
about
in
if you think
trouble.
about U.S. Grant.
Yeah,
U.S. Grant was an expert in logistics. That's why he learned in the Mexican War. That's why he was able to so effectively lead the Union effort in the Civil War. That he was a logistics expert. He was an engineer, essentially.
yeah, yeah,
Weirdly enough, so is R.E. Lee, but that's another story. But you
yeah.
see that the same mechanism is at work here. That
Interesting.
when you were moving groups of people around for preparing for battle, it's about moving people and their resources, their supplies, and it's logistics. It's more management. It's very complicated in what it's doing. But politics is complex.
Yeah,
And I think the same things that we see at the failures of U.S. Grant's presidency and Hoover's presidency and Carter's presidency was all because of failure of appreciating complexity of their moment.
yes, totally agree. Totally agree.
Cool.
Yeah.
And here again, I'll dive even further into my woo here. So I think I've laid out a case here that our approach to understanding complex systems is very different than our approach to understanding complex systems. And there's just so much that we can't know about complex systems, and our rational tools just don't seem to be up to the task. Which leads us to a critically important questions, which I will now put to you.
Uh-oh. No.
If we really have no idea what the outcome of our efforts will be, are we being irresponsible by meddling in complex systems? How can we justify the risks of initiating something that might turn out poorly?
Hmm.
If you have no answer, that's fine. I have one, but I just want to see if you have one before I win.
Um, I'm going to let you answer first.
Okay. How can we justify the initiating of something that might turn out poorly? My answer, faith. And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean any type of a religious faith, but actually a faith that people who generally pursue noble ends usually create those noble ends. And for good or ill, the energy we bring to our challenges becomes embedded in the solutions we create for our problems. Stephen, do you think my faith is justified?
I do. I do. Absolutely.
Okay.
We're obsessed with leadership in this country. And leadership, I've read several writers who say that the leadership process, leaders themselves, it's almost a spiritual experience because you are giving over a certain amount of faith and goodwill to someone to, advocate for you to see a vision through. I mean, leadership is full of all these kind of faith type images. When you think about a vision, you think about a dream, you think about, and that's what a vision is. It's a dream. And you're painting a picture for your followers that they can relate to. And for the followers, it takes a leap of faith to go for that thing that doesn't exist yet. All it is a concept or a theory or a positive future state. And so, yeah, I don't think faith is misplaced at all. I think it's very accurate here.
You have an answer for yourself at this point, or you think you want to let that lie?
Say that again.
I said I asked that question to you, and my answer was faith. After hearing my response, do you have a different response, or do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. I think that it all does come down to faith. It's the unknown. I mean, you know, I've heard this example a million times. John F. Kennedy, we will, get to the moon and we're going to do it like in 10 years or whatever it was. And everybody at NASA was like, this guy is out of his mind. These engineers are like, impossible. But his naive, he had faith, and he had that naive notion that this can be done. And just by stating it out loud and painting that picture for us, even though it went against all logic, it actually happened, So, it's metaphysical almost, how this actually comes about.
I agree. All right, so now I'm going to pick up a thread that I put aside a while ago.
Okay.
I said that complex systems are generally the province of life. However, for the first time, we are entering a realm of manufactured complexity. I'm speaking, of course, of artificial intelligence. Now, I'm far from being an expert in AI, but adaptive systems that are capable of integrating enormous amounts of data from a myriad of sources sounds like a complex phenomenon to me. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure.
So I am both fascinated and very concerned about the rise of AI. I see enormous potential, but what gives me pause is the same reason that I choose to work in complex systems. The energies we bring inform our work. Two of the initial primary research applications of AI will be in autonomous warfighting and crafting popular messages, i.e., propaganda. These energies brought to these endeavors concern me greatly, because regardless of whatever pleasant stories we tell ourselves about our motivations, there's no illusion that the outputs of these initiatives are pretty dark. Stephen, what are your thoughts on AI?
My thoughts are, I have a very naive, I actually have a lot of faith because, and again, it depends on, and I don't know enough about AI to know how it's programmed, but as it becomes more autonomous and can think for itself, if we will, and assuming that AI draws from, pretty much an infinite amount of information from human civilization, I want to believe that the answers that AI ultimately give us, if they are informed by literature and ethics and philosophy and science and metaphysics and everything, that the answer just, I was just telling my spouse the other day, I said, when I first started studying leadership, I had this sneaking feeling I was going to find out that, to be effective, you really don't need to cooperate. You really can be. Well, it turns out the good news is the more we cooperate, the more we work together, the more that we practice gratitude and altruism, even though it goes against most economic models and everything, it predicts group survival. And I think if AI's goal is to help us ultimately survive as a group, as a civilization, and not turn on us and bring us down for its own, I don't know how that would work. I mean, it's a science fiction movie, then I have a lot of faith. If it really does draw on the great thinking, the social science, everything we know about being human, it's always going to come to the conclusion that we got to find a way to cooperate. And as Pollyanna as it sounds, we got to be nice to each other. We have to cooperate.
And I agree with all of that. And and the and I think I want to say that you're right. I'm all I was simply saying is that these initial applications of AI are bringing in some. Um, I'm not happy with that being the foundation
Yeah, I
of
would
this.
agree with that, Nick. I hear where yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's off to a rocky start for
yeah.
sure.
I am waiting for people to bring their positive energies to this emerging complex phenomenon because I think the, the quicker we do that and get past some of these more darker ideas, the better off we'll all be.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well said.
Okay. All right. Last thing, and I'm now about to get to peak woo here. Okay, so you ready for it?
Okay, I'll take a drink of coffee here. Hold on. Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. So I'm going to start. I'm going to state an argument, only one I started playing around with, and I'd like you to either encourage it or push back on it as you wish. Okay.
Okay, fire
So,
away.
so recall that I'm a conflict scholar. I wrestle with why some disagreements are difficult to resolve, and my work on values was an attempt to try and understand those disagreements. When we consider complex systems, environmental stimulus injects energy into the system, but does so amorally. It's us that makes the energy either good or bad.
Right.
I'd submit that negative energies in any complex system emerge from felt pain.
Mm,
And specifically, we observe negative energies that we project onto others. That is to
mm,
say, that we observe negative energies in those who we feel are not recognizing or validating our pain.
mhm, mm.
Now, if that's true, then are there really negative energies at all? Or are we just seeing reflections of our own pain and allowing those reflections to inform us? So when I consider parties locked in an intractable conflict it's really hard to resolve. I think there is usually a broad misunderstanding between the adversaries. Both sides see the other as motivated by negative energies. But if, as I speculate, negative energies do not really exist, then both sides will see themselves as guided by positivity and presume the disagreeers must be driven by the negative. We project those negative energies, even though those negative energies only exist in our imaginations.
Mm, mm.
Now, I realize that this stuff may already be explored by others, but I'm not aware of anybody conceptualizing this way before in terms of a complex system. But if I'm right on this, then this has some substantial implications for how we study conflict, purely intractable conflict. Intractable conflict becomes a complex system with a break between major components. And that means we should be able to bring the tools of complexity systems theory to bear on conflict resolution methodology. What do you think?
I think it's great. And it makes me think of the idea of conflict asymmetry in organizations among individuals where there's a lot of good social psychological research on how when you really sit down and talk to parties in a conflict, one party might not even know there is a conflict. The other person is fuming and engaging in passive aggressive behavior, whatever. And the other person has no idea that there's even a conflict, or the weight of that conflict is out of balance. So, and that's all a matter of perception and in our imagination, as you suggested. So that's immediately where my mind went when you were
Uh-huh.
talking about this interesting line of inquiry. Yeah.
I'm just saying because I remember in our previous conversation about bringing in negative energies into AI, for example.
Hmm.
Uh, if I am right and negative energies don't really exist, well, then my fears are unbounded.
Correct.
So
Good
the,
point.
uh, I'm not sure to do that as yet, but that is a line of inquiry I want to at least explore a bit more because I can see potential criticisms of it, but it also gives me
Yeah.
some hope.
Yeah. I think, you know, a lot of folks are worried about the upcoming election, for example, and everyone's scratching their head. How in the world did we get in this fix? And why are we so divided? As difficult as it is, sometimes, we have to go through some kind of spasm or major conflict to reveal what the real problems are. And I think, our current situation is really a function of us um, seeing a symptom of a much larger disease. And I think eventually the disease is going to be exposed. Then we can do something about it. But right now we don't even really see it. It's like it's a Wizard of Oz kind of thing. There's something going on behind the curtain that until this thing either resolves or breaks down, we are not going to see what it is. And when we do finally see it, then we can start the rebuilding process. We can focus on the actual disease, the actual process, instead of the symptoms that we see, which is all this acrimony and conflict and name calling and just playground type behavior. It's like we're devolving almost because of this complex system that we just are seeing a tiny little bit of, and we just can't make it out completely.
And we discussed this and looking at again to looking at our current political environment. You and I both have our uh, own preferences about these things, but I think I know one of the things that I've been conveying to you offline is that how can the people on the other side have these beliefs about people
Mm-hmm.
on my side?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
again, it's what I was saying before, the projected negative
Negative
energies,
energy.
which
I
I
totally
think
agree.
which I think is totally fictitious.
Yeah.
And when which is what kind of put me down this rabbit hole a little bit here, that I think if we were to do some creative experimentation to kind of
Yeah.
dispel those fictions, I think we might go a long way to try and resolve
Yeah.
these conflicts.
For sure. And I mean, while we're on the election, I mean, I think a big problem that we have, and I think this is a problem by design. Our election cycles are way too long. I mean, almost any other democracy in the world or parliamentarian, man, the election cycles 90 days or sometimes even faster than that. And in our country, we let this family feud go on, and people get more and more pissed off at each other, and we start, you know, really looking down our nose at the other side, and we look at, libtards and deplorables, and it's like I can't even believe the language we use these days. Like, oh my gosh, I mean, and so I
Well,
think that's part of
be
the
frank,
problem.
that's 2016. The language has gone first in that in the past 8 years.
I'm just catching up, but I really do believe that when we talk about a complex system, we have to look at things like, how do we elect people? How does our election cycle work, and how can we make it less about money and more about issues, and less about personality and more about issues? Ralph Nader, who well, we don't need to talk about Ralph Nader, but he did bring up a great point when he ran for president, that we should shorten the election cycle. All campaign ads should be on a public access channel. If you want to watch them, you can go there. They're free. Everybody gets equal time, level the playing field. But the way it is now, it's just like it's a competitive sport that
Yeah.
we don't get a win. We just root for a team. We don't actually get to discern anything. I mean, it's like this big, reality show contest or a sports contest, and that can't be good for us. And so I think our complex system, we need to start right there, and say, how do we go about electing our officials?
Well, again, that runs the risk of maybe moving into complicated systems again, because that's again a focus on processes and things.
Good point.
I think we need to talk about people.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I agree. That's an excellent point.
So anyway, that was an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
I thank you for indulging me in my wood today, Stephen.
Absolutely, Nick. Always amazing to,
what
know,
key takeaways or concluding thoughts do you have for us?
That, I still think until we start to frame things the way you have so adroitly done it today, we're going to keep repeating the same mistakes. We got to start looking at things as complex. I love your points about negative energy and negativity generally being, in our own imagination and created by our own biases and experiences, the unresolved things that we need to be more self-reflective about these things. So, I think, you've given me a lot to think about today. We'll put it that way.
Sounds good. Well, this has been, again, a fun and deep conversation, and I appreciate us talking today. And I thank all of you folks out there who are listening. And until next time, this is Dr. Nick Wolf
and Dr. Stephen Lunenberger
reminding you to think better.